The warm Sunday afternoon in suburban Phoenix seemed like any other as 17-year-old Alex drove his grandmother's well-maintained Honda Civic. The familiar route to the pharmacy was one he'd taken dozens of times before, a simple errand to pick up his grandmother's heart medication. The car's air conditioning hummed softly against the Arizona heat as he carefully maintained the speed limit, knowing his grandmother's constant reminders about safe driving. Alex had always been the kind of grandson who put family first. Ever since his parents had taken jobs that required frequent travel, he'd stepped up to help care for his grandmother, who had raised him since he was little. Their bond went beyond the typical grandmother-grandson relationship. She was his rock, his guidance, and often his best friend. That day, Alex noticed a police cruiser following him for several blocks. He double-checked his speed, made sure his signals were working properly, and continued driving as normally as possible. His heart rate quickened slightly, not because he had done anything wrong, but because as a teenager, being followed by police was naturally nerve-wracking. The flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror came as a surprise. Alex did exactly what his grandmother had taught him. He signaled, pulled over safely, turned off the engine, and placed his hands where they would be visible on the steering wheel. Through his side mirror, he watched two officers approach, one on each side of the vehicle. "License and registration," the officer on the driver's side demanded, his tone unusually stern. Alex reached slowly for his wallet, narrating his movements just as his grandmother had instructed. "I'm getting my license from my wallet in my back pocket, sir," he said clearly, keeping his movements deliberate and calm. The situation took an unexpected turn when the officer suddenly ordered him out of the car. Confused but cooperative, Alex followed the instructions precisely, still not understanding what he could have done wrong. Within moments, he found himself being handcuffed and placed in the back of the police cruiser, watching in disbelief as the officers began searching his grandmother's car. Through the cruiser's window, Alex could see them methodically going through every compartment, their movements suggesting they were looking for something specific. His mind raced. What could they possibly be searching for? The car belonged to his grandmother, a retired elementary school teacher who spent her days tending to her garden and volunteering at the local library. As he sat there, Alex thought about his grandmother waiting at home for her medication. She needed it today. That's why he had offered to make the trip to the pharmacy in the first place. The weight of responsibility pressed against his chest as heavily as the handcuffs pressed against his wrists. The officers' search intensified. They popped the trunk, removed the spare tire, and checked under the hood. Their thoroughness suggested this wasn't a routine traffic stop. Alex watched as they huddled together, discussing something he couldn't hear, occasionally glancing back at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. After what felt like an eternity, one of the officers received a radio call. The change in their demeanor was immediate and noticeable. They stepped away from the car, engaged in an intense conversation, and kept looking at their phones, seeming to verify some kind of information. What Alex didn't know then was that this routine Sunday afternoon drive was about to uncover a story that would change not only his life but the lives of many others in his community. The officer's discovery would set in motion a chain of events that would expose a complex web of deception, challenge assumptions about appearances, and reveal how sometimes the most ordinary situations can lead to extraordinary revelations. The Arizona sun continued to beat down on the pavement as Alex sat in the police cruiser, unaware that in the next few hours, everything he thought he knew about his grandmother's quiet, simple life would be completely transformed. The truth that was about to emerge would shake the foundations of his understanding of family, trust, and the complex nature of human relationships. As one of the officers approached the cruiser again, his expression had shifted from stern suspicion to something else entirely, a mix of surprise and what almost looked like respect. This was just the beginning of a story that would soon capture the attention of their entire community, leaving everyone questioning how well they really knew their neighbors, and what secrets might be hiding behind the most unassuming facades. The officer opened the cruiser door, and his next words caught Alex completely off guard. "Son, we need to ask you a few questions about your grandmother." The officer's tone had shifted from accusatory to almost gentle, which only added to Alex's confusion. He was uncuffed and led to a nearby patrol car where a detective had just arrived. Inside the detective's car, the air conditioning provided a welcome relief from the Arizona heat, but Alex's mind was racing faster than ever. The detective, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes that contrasted with her serious expression, introduced herself as Detective Chen. She pulled out a tablet and showed Alex something that made his heart skip a beat, a series of old photographs. "Do you recognize this woman?" she asked, pointing to a photo that looked like a much younger version of his grandmother. But something was off. In the photo, she was wearing a lab coat and standing in front of what appeared to be a high-tech facility. Alex had never seen this photo before, and his grandmother had never mentioned working in any laboratory. As far as he knew, she'd always been an elementary school teacher. That looks like my grandmother," Alex stammered, "but I don't understand. She's been a teacher her whole life." The detective's expression softened further as she swiped to another photo. This one showed his grandmother in what appeared to be a military uniform, standing next to several official-looking people in suits. "Your grandmother's Honda Civic triggered our automated license plate readers," Detective Chen explained carefully. "The thing is, this car has been flagged in a database for over 30 years. We thought it was a mistake at first, given how old the alert was. But now..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We need to speak with your grandmother. And Alex, I need you to understand that what we're about to tell you might be difficult to hear." As they drove back to his grandmother's house, Alex learned that the kind, cookie-baking woman who had raised him might have been involved in one of the most significant scientific breakthroughs of the late 1980s. Detective Chen explained that his grandmother, or at least the woman he knew as his grandmother, had worked on a classified government project. But that wasn't what had triggered today's events. The detective's car pulled up to the familiar driveway of the modest suburban home where Alex had grown up. The garden his grandmother tended so lovingly was in full bloom, roses and desert flowers creating a colorful oasis in the harsh landscape. The wind chimes she had hung years ago tinkled softly in the breeze, their familiar sound now seeming somehow different, almost ominous. Before they could reach the front door, it opened. His grandmother stood there, still wearing her favorite blue gardening apron, but her expression wasn't one of surprise or worry about Alex being brought home by the police. Instead, she looked resigned, as if she had been expecting this day to come for a very long time. "You finally found me," she said quietly to Detective Chen, then turned to Alex with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart. I never wanted you to find out this way." She stepped aside to let them in, leading them to the living room that had been the setting for so many happy family memories. The walls were covered with photos of Alex growing up, school plays, baseball games, birthday parties, all moments that now felt somehow different. His grandmother settled into her favorite armchair, the one she usually sat in to tell Alex stories about her teaching days or to share family history. But today, she was about to tell a very different kind of story. She reached for a key that she wore on a chain around her neck, something Alex had never really noticed before, and pointed to the old trunk in the corner of the room, the one she had always said contained nothing but old teaching materials. "Detective," she said, her voice stronger now, "what you're looking for is in there. But before you open it, I need to explain everything to my grandson. He deserves to know the truth." She turned to Alex, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and regret. "What I'm about to tell you isn't easy, but please remember that everything I've done, every choice I've made, was to protect something bigger than myself." As Detective Chen moved toward the trunk, Alex watched his grandmother's hands nervously smoothing her apron, a gesture he'd seen countless times before when she was about to tell him something important. But this time, he knew whatever she was about to say would change everything he thought he knew about his family. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, creating an almost theatrical atmosphere in the familiar living room. The detective stood by the trunk, waiting patiently, while Alex perched on the edge of the sofa, his heart pounding. The scent of his grandmother's freshly baked cookies still lingered in the air. She had been baking when he left for the pharmacy, a detail that now seemed surreal given the gravity of the moment. His grandmother took a deep breath, and as she began to speak, Alex realized that the story she was about to tell would explain not only today's events but also the small inconsistencies he'd noticed over the years, the late-night phone calls she thought he hadn't heard, the mysterious packages that sometimes arrived, and the way she always seemed to know more about current events than any retired teacher should. As his grandmother began her story, Alex noticed how her posture changed. She sat straighter, her voice took on a clarity and authority he'd never heard before. Gone was the slight tremor that usually accompanied her storytelling about school days. This was a different woman emerging before his eyes. "I wasn't always Rose Henderson, the elementary school teacher," she began, her eyes focused on a point somewhere in the distance. 35 years ago, I was Dr. Catherine Wells, lead researcher at a government facility in Nevada. We were working on something that could have changed the world, clean energy technology that would have made nuclear power obsolete. Detective Chen had pulled up a chair, her notebook open but forgotten in her lap. The revelation of his grandmother's real name hit Alex like a physical blow. He'd grown up writing Rose Henderson on countless Mother's Day cards and school emergency contact forms. The name was as familiar to him as his own, and now it felt like a stranger's. "Our team was close to a breakthrough," his grandmother continued, her fingers absently tracing the pattern on her apron. "But there were others who wanted to use our research for something else, something terrible. They wanted to turn it into a weapon." She paused, looking directly at Alex. "I couldn't let that happen. Not after what I'd seen in my military days." The trunk in the corner seemed to loom larger as she spoke. Alex noticed that Detective Chen's hand had moved to rest near her service weapon, not threatening, but ready. The weight of unspoken dangers filled the room. "One night, I discovered documents showing that certain members of our team were already in talks with foreign agents. They were planning to sell our research to the highest bidder. The potential for destruction was..." She shook her head, unable to finish the thought. "I did what I had to do. I destroyed all our research data and fled with the only working prototype." Alex's mind raced back to all the times he'd helped his grandmother with her computer, how she'd always seemed deliberately technologically inept. Now he wondered if it had all been an act, if the woman who supposedly needed help sending emails had once been at the forefront of cutting-edge research. "The car they stopped you in today," she continued, "I've kept it all these years because it's special. The trunk has a hidden compartment that's shielded from detection. Inside that compartment is the last piece of evidence from those days, proof of what really happened, and who was behind the attempted theft." Detective Chen leaned forward. "Dr. Wells, Ms. Henderson, the statute of limitations on most of what happened back then has expired. But there are still people looking for you. People who've never stopped searching for what you took." His grandmother nodded grimly. "I know. That's why I've lived such a quiet life. Why I chose to become a teacher in a small community. Who would look for a top-secret military scientist among finger paintings and multiplication tables?" She smiled sadly at Alex. "And then you came into my life." Alex remembered being 6 years old, his parents dropping him off for what was supposed to be a temporary stay while they sorted out their careers. How his grandmother had transformed her home into a child's paradise overnight, with books and toys appearing as if by magic. "You chose to raise me," he said softly, "even knowing it might put you at risk." "You were the best thing that ever happened to me," she replied, her eyes welling with tears. "You gave me a reason to be more than just someone in hiding. You made Rose Henderson real." She reached for his hand. "Everything about our life together has been genuine, Alex. Everything except my past." Detective Chen cleared her throat gently. "We need to open the trunk now, Dr. Wells. Recent intelligence suggests that the people you were hiding from might have finally picked up your trail. That's why your car triggered our system today. Someone reactivated the old alert. His grandmother stood up, her movements precise and purposeful. She walked to the trunk and knelt beside it, her fingers working the old-fashioned lock with practiced ease. What's in here isn't just evidence of an old crime, she explained as she lifted the lid. It's proof of something much bigger, a conspiracy that goes to the highest levels of government and industry. The trunk creaked open, revealing what looked at first glance like ordinary teaching materials, old textbooks, faded construction paper, dried-out markers. But his grandmother reached beneath it all, her hands finding hidden catches and releases that Alex had never imagined existed. The false bottom of the trunk lifted away to reveal a space that seemed to glow with a faint blue light. This, she said, carefully lifting out a small metal container, is what they've been looking for all these years. Not just the prototype itself, but the proof of who was really behind everything. Names, dates, photographs, everything I couldn't reveal back then without putting countless lives at risk. As she handed the container to Detective Chen, a sound from outside made them all freeze. Car doors closing. Multiple sets of footsteps on the garden path. His grandmother's face went pale as she looked out the window, and for the first time that day, real fear showed in her eyes. "They're here," she whispered, her hand clutching Alex's arm. "After all these years, they've finally found us." Detective Chen was already on her radio, calling for backup, but Alex could tell by her expression that help might not arrive in time. His grandmother moved with unexpected swiftness, pulling Alex toward the kitchen. Detective Chen positioned herself near the front door, her hand on her weapon. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the windows, showing multiple figures approaching the house. "The back door," his grandmother whispered, her voice carrying an authority he'd never heard before. "There's a tunnel system under the garden shed. That's why I never let you help me organize it." As they moved through the kitchen, she grabbed a small backpack from behind the pantry door, one Alex had never seen before. Detective Chen's voice crackled over her radio, requesting immediate backup. "Dr. Wells," she called softly, "we have 3 minutes at most. They've got the house surrounded." The detective's calm professionalism somehow made the situation feel even more surreal. Alex's mind was reeling. The garden shed he'd passed countless times while mowing the lawn concealed a secret tunnel. His grandmother, the woman who spent hours baking cookies and helping him with homework, had prepared for this moment for decades. The ordinary suburban house he'd grown up in was actually a carefully planned escape route. A sharp knock at the front door made them all freeze. "Phoenix Police Department," a voice called out. Detective Chen's expression hardened. "They're not police," she said quietly. "Real officers would know I'm already here." His grandmother pulled a cellular phone from the backpack, not her usual flip phone that she claimed was all she needed, but a sophisticated smartphone. She typed rapidly, her fingers flying over the screen with practiced ease. "I'm activating the security protocols I set up years ago," she explained. "In 30 seconds, every piece of digital evidence I've gathered will be uploaded to secure servers worldwide." The knocking became more insistent. Through the kitchen window, Alex could see more figures moving through the backyard, approaching the garden shed. His grandmother noticed too, and a slight smile crossed her face. "They think they've found our escape route," she whispered. "The shed is a decoy. Watch." She pressed something under the kitchen sink, and a subtle rumbling vibrated through the floor. Outside, the garden sprinklers suddenly activated, but instead of water, they sprayed a dense, white fog that quickly covered the entire yard. The figures in the backyard began shouting in confusion. "Harmless smoke screen," his grandmother explained, moving to the pantry. "Something I developed in the lab, back when I was still Dr. Wells." She pressed against the back wall, and a section of shelving slid silently aside, revealing a narrow passage. "The real tunnel is here." Detective Chen checked her phone. "Backup is 4 minutes out. We need to move now." She turned to Alex's grandmother. "Dr. Wells, once we're in the tunnel, you need to tell me everything. If these people are who I think they are, this goes way beyond your old research project." As they entered the passage, his grandmother handed Alex a small device that looked like an old iPod. 30 years of evidence, she said quietly. Every illegal deal, every threatened scientist, every covered-up accident. I didn't just hide all these years, I've been gathering proof. The passage was narrow but tall enough to stand in, with subtle LED strips providing soft illumination. As the hidden door closed behind them, they could hear the front door of the house being broken down. His grandmother pressed another button on her phone, and the sound of multiple small explosions came from above. "Thermite charges," she explained, catching Alex's startled look. "Very small, very precise. They're destroying any trace of our research and evidence right now. Everything important is already digitized on that device you're holding." They moved quickly through the tunnel, which sloped gently downward. Alex could hear muffled shouts and confusion from above. His grandmother had just rendered her entire house, and everything in it, forensically useless to whoever was searching it. "I knew this day would come eventually," she said as they walked. "That's why I've spent years preparing. The people we're dealing with, they're not just corrupt officials or greedy corporations. They're part of something much bigger." She glanced at Detective Chen. "That's why they reactivated the alert on my car, isn't it? They're getting desperate." Detective Chen nodded grimly. 3 weeks ago, someone started connecting the dots. Multiple whistleblowers came forward simultaneously in different countries. They all had pieces of the same story, a global network of corruption involving energy companies, defense contractors, and high-level government officials. "My evidence is the missing piece," his grandmother said. "Proof that 30 years ago, they weren't just trying to steal clean energy technology. They were actively suppressing it, creating artificial scarcity while pushing the world toward more destructive alternatives." The tunnel curved gradually, and Alex realized they weren't heading away from the house but rather toward the local park where he'd played as a child. His grandmother had literally built an escape route that led to a public space, hiding it in plain sight. "Alex," she said softly, "I need you to understand something. What happened today, your arrest, the search of the car, it wasn't an accident. I knew they were closing in. I needed a way to contact Detective Chen's unit without alerting anyone who might be watching me. Using you." Her voice broke slightly. "Using you was the hardest decision I've ever made." The revelation hit Alex hard. "You knew they'd stop me? You let them arrest me?" "I arranged it," Detective Chen interjected. "Your grandmother contacted my unit last week. We've been working with a small international task force, gathering evidence of this conspiracy. When she told us she had proof that could blow the whole thing wide open, we set up today's operation. They reached what looked like a maintenance door, similar to the ones used by park workers to access underground irrigation systems." His grandmother checked her phone again. "The upload is complete. The evidence is out there now, being verified by journalists and investigators around the world. There's no stopping it." But as she reached for the door handle, a voice came from behind them in the tunnel. "That's where you're wrong, Catherine." The voice was elderly but firm, and it made his grandmother freeze in place. "After all these years, did you really think we wouldn't find your little escape route?" They turned to see an elderly man in an expensive suit, flanked by 2 younger men in tactical gear. He stepped forward, looking sadly at Alex's grandmother. Catherine, you should have just let it go. We could have made you very rich 30 years ago. Instead, you chose to become a schoolteacher, of all things." His grandmother stepped in front of Alex, shielding him with her body. "Hello, Robert," she said calmly. "Still doing the dirty work for your corporate masters after all these years?" The tension in the tunnel was palpable as Robert took another step forward, his expensive shoes clicking on the concrete floor. "You know," he said, his voice carrying a false warmth, "I've followed your life all these years, Catherine. Watched you play house in that little suburban home. Seeing you raise this boy." He gestured toward Alex. "It was quite the performance." "It wasn't a performance," his grandmother replied firmly, her hand still protectively in front of Alex. "That's something you never understood, Robert. Not everything is an act. Not everyone has a price." Detective Chen had positioned herself strategically, her weapon drawn but held low. "Robert Whitmore," she said clearly. "Former Director of Advanced Energy Research. Officially retired 15 years ago, but still on the payroll of 3 different energy conglomerates through shell companies." Robert's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well-informed, detective. But you're a bit late to this party. The evidence Catherine thinks she's released?" He pulled out his own phone, showing a screen full of error messages. "Our people intercepted the upload. Dead links, corrupted files, all of it, useless." But Alex's grandmother actually smiled. "Still as arrogant as ever, Robert. Did you really think I'd trust modern technology for something this important?" She nodded toward the device in Alex's hand. "That's not a transmitter, it's a receiver. The real upload happened hours ago, when Alex's arrest hit the police database." Alex remembered the police officers looking at their phones back at the traffic stop, apparently verifying information. Now he understood, they had been part of the plan all along, their actions triggering the release of his grandmother's evidence. Robert's confident expression faltered for the first time. One of his men whispered something in his ear, showing him something on a tablet. His face darkened. "What have you done, Catherine?" "I learned from you, Robert," she replied. "You taught me to always have a backup plan. Or in this case, several hundred backup plans." She stood straighter, her voice carrying the authority of her former identity as Dr. Wells. "Right now, every major news organization in the world is receiving proof of what your consortium has been doing for the past 3 decades. The evidence was devastating, documents showing how Robert's group had systematically buried clean energy patents, orchestrated false studies about alternative energy sources, and even arranged accidents to silence whistleblowers. But more importantly, it revealed the names of everyone involved, politicians, corporate executives, and foreign agents who had worked together to keep the world dependent on their controlled energy sources. It's not just about the technology anymore," his grandmother continued. "It's about every decision you and your associates corrupted, every life you ruined, every innovation you suppressed. The world is about to learn how a small group of people conspired to keep humanity dependent on fossil fuels when we had the capability for clean, nearly free energy all along." Robert's composed facade cracked further. "You have no idea what you're doing. The system exists for a reason. The world isn't ready for free energy. It would collapse the entire global economy." "No," Detective Chen interjected, "it would collapse your economy. Your power structure. Your control." She had been slowly moving into a better position, and Alex could now hear faint sounds from above. Backup was finally arriving. Robert must have heard it too. His expression hardened as he reached into his jacket. "Then you leave us no choice. If the world learns the truth now, the damage would be catastrophic. Sometimes, for the greater good, sacrifices must be made." But before he could withdraw his hand, a deafening alarm suddenly blared through the tunnel. Bright, disorienting lights began flashing from hidden panels in the walls. His grandmother had triggered another of her security systems. In the chaos that followed, several things happened at once. Detective Chen tackled Alex and his grandmother to the ground as a section of the tunnel ceiling suddenly opened, revealing a tactical team rappelling down. Robert's men were caught completely off guard, their weapons useless against the overwhelming force of the police response. Robert himself stood frozen, watching as decades of careful planning crumbled around him. "You don't understand," he said, almost pleading now. "We were protecting people. Keeping order. Without us." "Without you," his grandmother interrupted, rising to her feet, "the world will finally have a chance to progress. 30 years ago, you turned my research into a weapon to maintain your power. Today, I'm turning the truth into a weapon to break it." The tactical team had secured Robert and his men. Above ground, Alex could hear the sounds of multiple vehicles and helicopters. Detective Chen received a radio message and smiled. "Dr. Wells, you'll be happy to know that simultaneous raids are currently taking place in 27 countries. Your evidence was very thorough." As they were finally led out of the tunnel, emerging into the park where Alex had played as a child, he saw the scale of what had happened. News helicopters circled overhead. Police vehicles surrounded the area. And on everyone's phones, notifications were popping up about a breaking worldwide story, the exposure of a global conspiracy that had suppressed clean energy technology for decades. His grandmother squeezed his hand. "I'm so sorry you had to find out this way," she said softly. "But I couldn't tell you before. Not until everything was in place. Your genuine reactions today were crucial, they had to believe you knew nothing." Alex looked at the woman who had raised him, the woman who had stored world-changing secrets while helping him with his math homework, who had built escape tunnels while tending her garden, who had spent decades gathering evidence while creating a loving home for him. "You're still my grandmother," he said firmly. "That's what matters." The next 24 hours passed in a whirlwind of activity. Alex and his grandmother were taken to a secure location, a modern hotel suite with panoramic views of Phoenix, now serving as a temporary safe house. As night fell over the city, they watched from their window as news helicopters continued to circle, their spotlights scanning the streets below. His grandmother sat in a comfortable armchair, looking both exhausted and relieved as she sipped her tea, the same chamomile blend she always had at home. Even now, after everything that had happened, she maintained some of her familiar routines. A news tablet lay in her lap, displaying headlines that were growing bigger by the hour. Global energy conspiracy exposed. 30-year cover-up revealed. Clean energy suppression, the full story. Alex watched as his phone lit up with messages from friends and classmates. The story was everywhere, and people were beginning to make the connection. His ordinary life as the grandson of a retired teacher had been transformed into something that seemed straight out of a movie. "Your parents are on their way," his grandmother said softly, breaking the silence. "They've been briefed about everything. I've had a security team watching over them too, all these years." She paused, setting down her tea. "I hope you understand now why they traveled so much, why I encouraged them to take those international jobs. It was safer for them to be moving targets than stationary ones." The realization hit Alex hard. "You've been protecting all of us, all this time." He thought about his parents' constant travels, how they'd always seemed to have last-minute schedule changes and unexpected diversions. Did they know about any of this? His grandmother shook her head. "No. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was. Your parents thought they were just ambitious professionals building their careers. In reality, my security team was subtly guiding their job opportunities, keeping them moving, making them harder to track." Detective Chen entered the suite, carrying fresh coffee and a stack of papers. Over the past day, she'd shed her role as an arresting officer and emerged as something closer to a family friend. "Dr. Wells," she said, setting down the papers, "the initial statistics are coming in. Your evidence has led to over 300 arrests worldwide. The encryption keys you released have unlocked decades of hidden communications." His grandmother nodded, but her eyes were on Alex. "What matters now is what happens next. The technology one helped develop 30 years ago, it's not just about energy. It's about freedom. Freedom from dependency, from artificial scarcity, from the control systems that Robert and his associates built. A gentle knock at the door revealed a team of government scientists, eager to speak with Dr. Catherine Wells about her revolutionary research. But she held up a hand, stopping them before they could start their questions. "Tomorrow," she said firmly. "Tonight is for my family." As the scientists respectfully withdrew, Alex watched his grandmother pull out her phone, her real phone, not the simple flip phone she'd pretended to barely understand. With a few quick taps, she brought up a holographic display that filled the center of the room. Three-dimensional schematics and equations floated in the air, beautiful in their complexity. "This is what they were so afraid of," she explained, manipulating the display with practiced ease. "A way to harness energy that exists all around us, without depleting resources, without devastating the environment. But more than that, it's a key to understanding how our universe works." Her eyes lit up with the passion of a true scientist. "And now, finally, I can share it with the world." Alex studied the floating equations, remembering all the times his grandmother had helped him with his high school physics homework. "You dumbed it down for me," he said, half laughing, half accusatory. "All those times you pretended to struggle with basic science." She smiled warmly. "I had to maintain my cover. But I always tried to slip in little hints, little pieces of real knowledge hidden in the simplified explanations. You have no idea how hard it was to pretend I didn't understand quantum mechanics when you were working on your science fair project." Detective Chen received a message on her secure phone and quickly read it. "Dr. Wells, the president wants to speak with you. They're calling it a matter of national security." She paused, looking uncertain for the first time. "They're also talking about medals, commendations, official recognition for your years of service." His grandmother waved it away. "The only recognition I care about is the truth finally being known. And..." She reached for Alex's hand, "knowing that my family understands why I lived a lie for so long." The suite's phone rang, the front desk announcing the arrival of Alex's parents. His grandmother stood, smoothing her clothes with the same nervous gesture she'd always used before parent-teacher conferences. But now Alex recognized it for what it was, a brilliant scientist and secret agent preparing to reveal her true identity to her own family. As footsteps approached their door, his grandmother quickly turned to Alex. "Whatever happens next, whatever they say or ask of me, I want you to know something. Every moment we shared, every lesson I taught you, every time I bandaged a scraped knee or celebrated a victory, that was all real. Being your grandmother, that's not just a cover story. It's the most important identity I've ever had." The door opened, and Alex's parents burst in, their faces a mixture of confusion, worry, and awe. Behind them, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance, fireworks began to explode, spontaneous celebrations as news of the day's revelations continued to spread. His grandmother, Dr. Catherine Wells, straightened her shoulders and prepared to tell her story one more time. But first, she pulled Alex close and whispered, "Thank you for showing me that sometimes the best disguise isn't a fake identity or a hidden bunker. Sometimes, it's simply love." The next morning brought a new reality that none of them could have imagined just days ago. The hotel suite had been transformed into a makeshift command center, with secure communications equipment and multiple screens displaying news coverage from around the world. Alex's parents sat on the couch, still processing everything they'd learned about the woman who had raised their son. His father, a usually composed business consultant, kept shaking his head in disbelief. "All those times you insisted we take those international assignments," he said to his mother-in-law. "The sudden opportunities that would come up, you were orchestrating all of it?" "Not orchestrating," his grandmother corrected gently. "Just guiding. Making sure you had options that would keep you safe while building your careers." She turned to Alex's mother. "Remember that teaching position in Singapore that fell through at the last minute? That was when we detected unusual surveillance in the area. I couldn't tell you why, but I had to make sure you didn't take it. Alex's mother wiped tears from her eyes. We thought we were just lucky, always finding better opportunities at the right moment. All this time, you were protecting us. She reached for her son's hand. Protecting Alex. Detective Chen entered with a team of government officials, their faces serious but respectful. Dr. Wells, the President's Science Advisory Team is ready for your briefing. And there's something else you need to see. She handed over a tablet displaying security footage from various locations around the world. The images showed people gathering in cities across the globe, not in protest, but in celebration. Signs reading, "Thank you Dr. Wells," and "The truth sets us free," were visible in crowds from Tokyo to London, Sydney to Sao Paulo. The world wasn't reacting with panic to the revelation of a decades-long conspiracy. Instead, there was a sense of hope, of possibility. Your research is already being verified by independent scientists, Detective Chen reported. The preliminary results are revolutionary. Teams in 12 countries have confirmed that your energy generation theory is sound. They're calling it the Wells Principle. His grandmother smiled wryly. I always thought it would be named after the whole team. Before everything went wrong, we were so close to making it work. She pulled up her holographic display again, but this time instead of equations, she showed photographs of her old research team. These people believed in the possibility of changing the world. Robert and his consortium didn't just steal our research, they stole these people's dreams. Alex studied the faces in the old photographs, young scientists full of hope and determination. What happened to them? He asked quietly. Most were discredited professionally, their careers destroyed by manufactured scandals or false accusations. Some. She paused, pain evident in her voice. Some had accidents that weren't really accidents. I was one of the few who managed to disappear completely. She looked at her family. That's why becoming Rose Henderson wasn't just about hiding, it was about surviving, about keeping the truth alive until the world was ready for it. A notification popped up on one of the screens. Robert Whitmore had begun talking to federal investigators. The names he was revealing reached into the highest levels of governments and corporations worldwide. The conspiracy was unraveling faster than anyone had anticipated. He'll try to paint himself as a patriot, his grandmother said, watching the news coverage. He'll claim they were protecting the world from chaos, preventing economic collapse. But what they really protected was their own power, their control over resources that should have belonged to everyone. Detective Chen's phone buzzed with another update. Dr. Wells, the Department of Energy is implementing your security protocols for the research data. They're calling it the most significant scientific breakthrough of the century. She paused, smiling slightly. They also want to know if you'd consider leading the new clean energy initiative. Apparently, the president specifically requested you. His grandmother looked around the room, at the family she'd protected for so long, at the future she'd sacrificed everything to make possible. I have some conditions, she said finally. First, the research stays open source. No patents, no proprietary claims. This belongs to everyone. The officials nodded, taking notes as she continued. Second, we establish a fund for the families of my old research team. They deserve to know their loved ones didn't die in vain. Her voice grew stronger. And third, I want to continue teaching, not just university lectures or research seminars, but real teaching. The next generation needs to understand not just the science, but the responsibility that comes with it. Alex watched as the officials readily agreed to everything. His grandmother, Dr. Catherine Wells, had spent decades hiding her brilliance, pretending to be less than she was. Now, she was finally able to stand in her full power, and the world was listening. There's one more thing, she added, turning to Alex. My grandson gets full access to the research facility. He has a unique perspective on both the science and the ethical implications. Plus, she smiled warmly, he's already proven he can keep a secret. As the day progressed, more revelations emerged. The evidence his grandmother had gathered didn't just expose the energy conspiracy, it revealed a complex web of corruption that had influenced everything from climate policy to technological development. But with each shocking disclosure, there was also hope for change, for progress, for a future that had been denied to humanity for too long. Alex's phone buzzed with messages from his friends, all asking variations of the same question, did you know? He thought about all the years living with his grandmother, all the little moments that now held new meaning. The way she'd taught him to question everything, to look beyond surface appearances, to understand that the simplest explanation wasn't always the correct one. No, he typed back to his friends, I didn't know she was a world-changing scientist. But I always knew she was extraordinary. 1 month later, Alex stood in the doorway of their new home, watching his grandmother tend to her newly transplanted rose garden. Some things hadn't changed, she still wore her favorite gardening apron, still hummed while she worked, still took the same careful attention with each plant. But now, there was an openness to her movements, a freedom that came from no longer having to hide. The high-security research facility where she now worked was just a 15-minute drive away. She had insisted on a house with a garden, refusing the luxury apartments and gated communities that government officials had suggested. I spent 30 years building a normal life, she had told them. I'm not about to stop now just because the world knows my name. Alex watched as a sleek government car pulled up to their driveway. Detective Chen, now the head of a new international task force, stepped out, carrying a familiar-looking box. His grandmother stood up, brushing dirt from her knees, and smiled in recognition. The last of your things from the old house, Detective Chen said, handling the box carefully. The forensics team finally cleared them. She paused, looking at the garden. You know, most people in your position would be living in a penthouse by now, Dr. Wells. His grandmother took the box, her eyes twinkling. Most people in my position never had the chance to discover the joy of growing their own tomatoes. She opened the box, revealing photo albums and small mementos from their old life. Besides, revolution doesn't have to mean giving up the simple things. And it had been a revolution. In the weeks since the revelation of his grandmother's identity and the exposure of the global energy conspiracy, the world had changed more rapidly than anyone could have predicted. Her clean energy technology was already being implemented in pilot programs across the globe. Robert Whitmore and his associates were facing international tribunals. But more importantly, a new sense of possibility had awakened in people everywhere. Alex's parents had moved nearby, their traveling days over now that there was no need to keep them moving. His father had taken a position advising companies transitioning to the new energy systems, while his mother worked with a foundation helping families of the original research team members. Inside their new home, the living room looked much like their old one, family photos on the walls, comfortable furniture, the same old Afghan throw on the couch. But now there was also a state-of-the-art laboratory in the basement, and a secure communication center disguised as a home office. His grandmother had refused to completely separate her scientific work from her family life. I spent too many years compartmentalizing, she explained as they sat down for their regular evening tea. The scientist, the grandmother, the secret keeper, they're all part of who I am. I won't divide myself anymore. Detective Chen joined them, accepting a cup of the same chamomile tea they'd always served visitors. The president's asking about your progress on the global implementation plan, she mentioned casually. His grandmother smiled. Tell her what I always say, science moves at its own pace. We're not just installing new technology, we're changing how humanity thinks about energy, about resources, about our relationship with the planet itself. She reached for one of her fresh-baked cookies, another constant in their changing world. Alex's phone buzzed with a message from his school principal. The science department was still hoping his grandmother would give a guest lecture. She had been declining such requests from universities and research institutions worldwide, but she'd promised her first public talk would be at Alex's school. They deserved to hear it first, she had insisted. Those students, with their science projects and their questions about the universe, they're exactly who I did all this for. She looked at Alex. You taught me that, you know. Watching you grow up, seeing your curiosity about the world, it reminded me why we did the research in the first place. A notification on the secure screen showed another successful implementation of her energy technology, this time in a remote village that had never had reliable electricity before. The images showed children reading under bright lights, medical equipment running steadily, wells pumping clean water, all powered by the system his grandmother had protected for 3 decades. Your old research team would be proud, Detective Chen said softly. Their families, they're finding peace in knowing the truth, in seeing their loved ones work finally helping people. His grandmother nodded, her eyes distant for a moment. We were so young then, so full of dreams about changing the world. We never imagined it would take this long, or cost so much. She turned to Alex. But we also never imagined that the next generation would be the key to making those dreams real. As the evening sun cast long shadows through the windows, Alex realized that their story, which had seemed to reach its climax with the dramatic revelations a month ago, was really just beginning. His grandmother wasn't just sharing her scientific knowledge, she was teaching the world about courage, about patience, about the power of ordinary lives to hide extraordinary truths. You know what I miss sometimes, she said, surprising them both. Parent-teacher conferences. There was something wonderful about discussing spelling tests and multiplication tables, about helping shape young minds in small, everyday ways. Detective Chen laughed. Dr. Catherine Wells, revolutionary scientist, missing grammar lessons? Rose Henderson wasn't just a cover story, his grandmother said firmly. She was a teacher who loved her students, who believed in the power of education. Catherine Wells is a scientist who can change the world's energy systems. I'm both of those women, and I wouldn't have it any other way. As night fell, they could see distant lights twinkling in the city, lights now powered by the technology his grandmother had protected for so long. But here in their home, it was the warm glow of family that mattered most. The world outside might know her as Dr. Catherine Wells, the scientist who changed history, but to Alex, she would always be, first and foremost, his grandmother. Ready for our chess game? She asked him, setting up the board just as she had thousands of times before. And this time, I won't pretend not to see your strategy coming. Alex laughed, realizing that even their casual games had been part of her careful balance of truth and deception. But as they began to play, he understood that some things, like love, family, and the simple joy of sharing time together, had never been an act at all.